welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm here with Jon Repetti of the 5 Good Hour substack. He is a PhD candidate at Princeton, and I'm not going to hold that against him. And
dude, everybody else does. You might as well. And I deserve it. Like, let's be.
So we're here to talk about the relevance of continental philosophy for the left, and we're going to start with one of my favorite bugbears. Jon here is going to convince me not to hate Team France. And between my studies of French left communism and French theory, which is both overlapping and also not quite the same thing, with the exception of Lyotard and Baudrillard, I tend to not be on Team France. I'm notoriously skeptical of Lacan. I think the mirror phase is legitimate and everything else is sus. I have come around on not hating Althusser as much as I used to, which is just to say I think he has some useful things to ponder. But I tend to be of Team Germany, even though I also have like my deep-seated suspicion about German idealism's ultimate project as well. So Jon here is going to start us off trying to convince me that I shouldn't throw France into the dustbin of theory, into the elephant graveyard of, well, I've always associated French critical theory with where all the other philosophy, science, and everything else that failed went to die as an elephant graveyard and get picked up by English majors for paper writing. That's like the way I interpreted it. That also tells you when I was exposed to it, though, in grad school, and what I was exposed to it for, the writing of papers, as opposed to what it was originally for, which was, in a lot of cases, the 60s and 70s work, dealing with the developments and seeming failures of the various left movements in France, which I have found, learning the context of French theory, that I hate it less. But we're going to start today with Lacan versus Althusser. And if you notice that I'm overpronouncing French names, it's because I butchered all the French names in the last time I talked about French stuff so bad that like French speakers actively complained, and my only response to them is like, well, I could be worse. You have no idea what I used to pronounce French names like.
Did you get shit over Kojave? Was it Kojave that really got him?
Yeah, Kojave, all the names of French socialist groups that I didn't know how to immediately translate, because I know enough Latin languages to normally like see what French means, but have no idea how to say it. So like, it's one of those things where there was this way back in grad school when I was in a poetry translation class. One of the challenges we were told was to pick a language related to a language that we knew and translate the poem, which I don't know why they did that to us, but I picked French and Romanian because, I know enough Spanish and Italian. I don't pronounce Italian correctly either. Spanish I can do. So all that stuff about names and Team France. So people might just want to go, I'm hostile to Team France. My favorite French philosophers are like Closgard, maybe, like people who aren't commonly read in English, actually. Baudrillard's okay sometimes before 1985, and Althusser is okay.
So what shifted for you about Althusser? I mean, was it sort of recognizing him as the crypto Maoist he always was, and then sort of taking him on as more of a weirdo than the Anglophone Academy is willing to let him be?
Right. Well, he's a crypto Maoist who's really a left Maoist because he had a critique of Stalin, but he hid it because reasons. And I became fascinated with the fact that basically he is obsessed with Spinozian physics, which I don't think is scientific, but nonetheless, I get why someone would get obsessed with it. And which means you're also obsessed with like ancient physics. Basically, you're into like pre-Socratic and Socratic physics, and I have a soft spot for that shit. But I also think the relationality of structuralism actually is something interesting. Like there is a there. Even if I think he, for example, one critique I have of Althusser is like he's a borderline anarchist, but he also constructs the state in a French absolutist mode that I don't think is justifiable, but it's pretty common from French political thinkers, like going
and a function of his Catholicism, right? And a function of like, you know, the big S subject, you know, of the ISA essay is really, you can read the Catholic schoolboy there who is made to kneel and to confess. Is just, you know.
Well, first question then. What? So Althusser is barely a crypto-Catholic, more just straight up a Catholic Marxist. His Catholicism's often not explored enough. But is Lacan a secret Catholic reactionary? Yes, no.
That's pretty good. Man, oh, God. Is Lacan... if it's secret, I don't think they kept it secret from me. I've always kind of recognized in Lacan a certain, like a kind of medievalism, a kind of like, you know, I think his big other has a lot to do with sort of the, you know, Aquinas and like Aquinas's substance, like a medieval view of God more than almost any other figure. Like even though the medievals don't really show up a lot in his actual writing, you know, I'm sort of in your camp about French absolutism and this question of the state. Like that's sort of what ultimately turned me off of Deleuze and turned me off especially of Deleuzians who talk about the state as if it is this totalizing entity that we know that it isn't, that every ounce of actual lived experience shows us that it isn't. Nonetheless, I would say that how do I start here? I would say that for Lacan especially, Catholicism is, as critiqued through Pascal, as he is what's really important. It's that classic line from Pascal, you know, kneel down and you will believe. This idea that like the truth of your belief is in your actions, even if you don't hold it internally. It's the action that speaks and that constitutes belief, and that whatever you think differently, it is what you are performing that is your truth. You know, that's incredibly abstract, but I think it's a really important political insight. And Zizek does like a bunch with this, you know, and it's one of the few things about Zizek that I've kind of kept with me throughout my political life and throughout my, you know, maturity, like intellectual maturity, is that like what to say that you believe is to do is to believe, I think. And that is the essence of Lacanian analysis, because Lacanian analysis is all about interpreting, even more so than the signifier of the voice. It's about the stutter, the action, the word, the fiddling, you know. The analyst sort of watches the analysand and all of their little, more than verbal tics, physical tics, you know, like which knuckle do you crack when you say what words, when you bring what memories up, like how do you fiddle, where do your fingers go? And that to me is a micro insight from the clinic that has larger implications that a lot of people try to do too much with, that say the Ljubljana people try to do far too much with too quickly without intervening mediations, but which is useful to us.
So when I first dallied in my recovery from my right-wing period. The hip theory on the left was Slavian school interpretations of French theory and Badiou and that sort of like crypto neo-Maoism, and then Laurel and that whatever the fuck Laurel is doing, I don't know, crack. And I actually take Laurel more seriously than that, even though he's an anti-Marxist in some ways. Or a post-Marxist, although post-Marxist in a lot of cases may as well be anti in a lot of them.
Like
and at least in like someone like Baudrillard. So I interestingly, the more I learned about what I like to jokingly refer to as Team France, the more I became interested in French thinkers who are not commonly respected in America. Lacan, a lot of the French ultra left, although a lot of them go very weird. Lyotard is like the least weird of them, and you start getting to like the people around the old Mont bookstore and all that. You get into some very like bizarre left-right hybrid stuff. But to get back onto the topic of structuralism, I've always kind of tried to wrestle with what is meant, by my butchering of Kojève, but that there's a weird Heideggerian reading of Hegel that runs through all this stuff that is foreign to me. The Sartre being literally the he's a critic of Hegel, but at least I recognize him talking about the Hegel that I read in college. Right. Whereas when I was getting into, a lot of the assumptions about Hegel that come through Lacan, and also through the Slavian school, that it's read through this psychologicalization, psychoanalytic interpretation, and it's read through Kojève. And how do I actually say that?
Kojève.
Yeah.
The French
tendency to French tendency to put vowels in and just not say them, as if silent letters are somehow sexy. But anyway, Team France is gonna be real mad at me for this interview.
Man, yeah, no. So Sartre. So I'm glad you brought up Sartre, because Sartre is, I think, for me, the figure that brings both Althusser and Lacan kind of into some kind of clarity. And for me, the Sartre that matters is the late Sartre, like the Sartre of the Critique of Dialectical Reason and the Sartre of the Search for a Method, which is sort of the last major book before he starts writing the existential biographies, like The Family Idiot, which is about Flaubert, and Saint-Genet, which is about Jean Genet, and that became these kind of long attempts to fully integrate a writer into their place in history. And what preceded those late projects was this unfinished 2-volume sort of monolith. It was supposed to really be his attempt not to synthesize Marxism and existentialism, but to sort of put existentialism in the service of a post-Stalinist Marxism that would not be a merely humanist Marxism, that would not be a kind of cushy-feely,
wouldn't be French Communist Party a la Khrushchev Marxism, right?
Yeah, it would not be that, and it wouldn't be a Maoism, and it was his attempt to kind of invent one might even say a third way Marxism that does not shy away, that does not try to overly humanize the discourse. And what comes out of this is this 300-page book that still does not have like a great, that does not have any scholarly edition in English, really. It has translations, but they're not like academic editions, called The Search for a Method, which is where he says that Marxism is what we have to think of as the is the only philosophy of our time. It is the science of history. It is the only discourse capable of absorbing all the other discourses. And we have to put existentialism, psychoanalysis, and the various historicisms and sociologisms of the time sort of in service to Marxism, not in the Lukácsian sense of like kind of developing them according to the Marxian method, like sort of just rendering each of these things pseudo-dialectical, but thinking about them in terms of this sort of larger overdetermined structural causality. It's very much aligned with the project that's going on with the Reading Capital group. That's always been my feeling about it. And that when Althusser critiques Sartre in Marxism and Humanism, he's really talking about a Sartre that's not theoretically mature, or a Sartre that only will emerge with the critique of dialectical reason, and with the search for a method. And and my point that I've brought up many times is that it is through the search for a method that we can get a better account of what Althusser means by overdetermination, because it's a way of thinking through the various levels of historical experience, like existentialism being the sort of phenomenological singular man, how the world is experienced in a sort of immediate, or as close to an immediate manner as we can account for it. Psychoanalysis, which attempts to account for the birth of the child, the upbringing of the child, its first integration into a historical milieu, and the sociological, which is a pre-philosophical account of the fundamental social structures of a given period. And then it's only through Marxism that we can account for how all three of those levels are interconnected might be the wrong word, are overdetermined by each other, are absorbed into each other, produce one another, and are produced in turn, and sort of link up to something like history considered as a process. And this is hyper abstract, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it is, but it's also, I've read the two books you're talking about, and they are actually that abstract. But it does give me a key to why would Althusser go into such a project in the first place? Like, you get the frustration with the Khrushchevized and the Stalinized, actually, French Communist Party of the 50s and 60s. Like, that's clear. Then you have his early quasi-religious Hegelianism, which is bizarre to me, frankly. I like, as a person who has spent a whole lot of time with Hegel, I often feel like when I read about Althusser's Hegel, I don't totally recognize either when he was pro him or when he was anti him. Like, it's a very
his Hegel in either period is always a version of Stalin, is always like a kind of like the Hegel of what a Sartre will call the external dialectic, like history as a kind of like transcendental super subject that is moving the little sorry, my wedding ring just fell off. That will move the sort of little actors of history along the chessboard. It's what he'll call in Reading Capital, like the expressive dialectic, and it's an incredibly limited and underbaked theory of Hegel on Althusser's part that I just think is not helpful to I think it was necessary for him to posit that Hegel, but in order to develop what becomes a fairly, what the Ljubljana people say is actually a fairly Hegelian account of the totality, which is the account of overdetermination.
So, one of the things that I will say now, to sound like a total rube, is that I come from the 1990s. And in the 1990s, if you were in high school, the philosophy you found was Camus, Nietzsche, Sartre, right? But it's the Sartre of the biographies. It's the Sartre of nausea. It's, you know, it's not this more philosophically interesting stuff, which is why until I was in my 30s, I never looked to Sartre as a connector piece to what was going on in France. I saw the French left communist tradition and like the situationist and all that. And then I saw theory, and the only bridge that you had was Baudrillard's relationship to the Communist Party and him being pissed off about what happened during the Mitterrand period, and whatever the fuck Bataille was doing, which, having read a ton of Bataille, I have a whole shelf of Bataille back there. I still don't know. And me going, oh, okay, maybe I need to look into Sartre beyond the debates between him and Camus and all the stuff that you would learn in a like basic, like high school level introduction to existentialism. Because when you first encounter existentialism, you go, how did these guys ended up being Marxists? Because it is not obvious in the way you were commonly taught back then, existentialist philosophy. So realizing in my 30s that I really needed to understand the existentialist critique of humanism, particularly of like Italian Marxist humanism, of, you know, and then having enough context of what was going on in the Soviet Union about Soviet humanist rhetoric in the 1950s, and how that actually corresponded with the formerly Comintern aligned Western European parties moving even further to the right, you know, sometimes actually even to the right of the Social Democrats. And that clarified a ton to me, but it still has not made sense to me how, for example, Lacan, as I somewhat flippantly asked you in the very beginning, is he a Catholic reactionary or not, became this key figure for the left. Because the other thing I was going to mention is the other major school of leftist theory was the Deleuze, Lacan, like Foucault, maybe Althusser, but Althusser is not particularly sexy. And we're not going to go into the other members of that Capital Reading Group like Balabar, Rassiere, unless you got advanced. And I was very confused as to, one, why were all these quasi-Marxists being discussed so much in the academy other than Derrida and him being annoying? For those of you who are listening, I'm not even pretending to be unbiased here. And two, like this attempt at this reconciliation between Marx, Nietzsche, and Heidegger that seemed particularly not German but French. And when I was reading some of the stuff you've written and watching some of your posts, and I was like, oh, maybe you can give me a clarity, because I'm always told to understand Althusser, I don't need to understand Sartre. I need to understand, I don't know, Lacan, right? And reading Lacan and reading Althusser, I'm like, that relationship seems more anxious than I'm commonly taught it. Right.
I mean, anxious is exactly the word. I mean, Althusser was Lacan's analysand. I mean, this is an incredibly close relationship. Sartre is also analyzed by Lacan once, and Lacan at the end of the session says, like, you have no unconscious, you know, which is basically saying, which is short for you suffer from psychosis. The psychotic for Lacan has no unconscious, which is, you know, it's a sort of, Sartre actually took it as a compliment. And he
seemed to develop the whole theory around it, frankly. But so the question, okay, there's a few questions here. Sartre, to me, is, and not just to me, but also like to my advisors, to some, you know, like I think to a growing body of literature about this, Sartre is a hinge point. He is a figure not unlike Heidegger, not unlike even Kant, like against which that entire generation of
Althusser, Lacan, Badiou, etc., need to position themselves in and within and against. Sorry, what? I thought you said something. Sorry. So Deleuze will say in a late essay, he was my teacher, that like Sartre and the theory of groups that he develops in the Critique of Dialectical Reason is really at the heart of what him and Guattari are trying to do in Anti-Oedipus. Lacan will bring up Sartre and the idea of the gaze like over and over again as a kind of like essential text for him, like almost as essential as what Freud develops. Like there are these Sartrean concepts that seem to disconnect themselves from the bigger edifice of Sartre's thought and make their way and form their own mini edifices within thought of other thinkers who then develop them into entire systems on their own. There's this incredible like productivity to Sartre's work, especially to like the work of Being and Nothingness and to the early literature. But as for why Lacan was taken by the left, because a lot of his students are Maoists. The simple answer. A lot of his students were either Maoists. There was a Maoist Lacan group, like a sect within the seminar that met separately and would talk about the seminar and read the Little Red Book and like have these sort of try to form some kind of synthesis between them. This is part of where Badiou comes from. I'm not sure if he was actually in that group, but he was sort of aligned with their project. There's also Kristeva and the feminists who have their own complicated relation to the Soviet Union, to sort of official communism, to the official French Academy, etc., who are important figures. So historically, there are just these coteries. I mean, I hate to be so vulgar as to say that it's about like individual and immediate relationships, even within the École Normale Supérieure and within French academia writ large, but it is in some ways as simple as these people knew each other, they cited each other, they talked to each other, and they worked together, and they thought on the left that Lacan needed to be responded to, as did Althusser. There's that famous graffiti from the 68 riots. What is Althusser for? Structures don't march in the streets. This sort of rejection of structuralism as another kind of determinism that is holding back the practical side of popular evental French communism. But at the same time, they looked to both Althusser and Lacan as figures who could help explain why 68 did not work. Lacan held the seminar during the riots. It was famously interrupted. Like there would be demonstrations out in the street, and he would be drawing his like the various 4 discourses on the board, and essentially unbothered, and saying like this, while everybody else is in this moment of rapture, like saying like this is a passing fad, like this will be over in 3 weeks, like you want another father, you will have one. And I think that there was a generation of serious people on the left in France who said, well, shit, like he was right. Like we did, like, that we begged de Gaulle to come back and save us, daddy. Like there was like that they sort of, and I think that they felt that after that, they had to not just contend with Lacan, like the Lacanian edifice, but like why was he able to see that? That's my speculative answer. And Badiou will come up with his own answer, and he'll give a series of seminars on Lacan. Deleuze and Guattari will write Anti-Oedipus is basically a polemic against Lacan and for a different kind of analysis that is not of the signifier but is of the machine. But all of it sort of happens that they find the adversary to be extremely productive. Each individual group does. Is that sensible?
Yeah. So what happens in translation into American theory is Lacan goes from being an adversarial anxiety, but is still a primary influence because you have to respond to his form of psychoanalysis in a different way than, say, the other French psychoanalysis. One of the things that I can tell you is I recently, last year, wrote a long paper for the Society of Intellectual History, which will one day be a chapter of a book that I'm writing with Shalom Bentine on Christopher Lasch. And I didn't include this in the essay, but I became fascinated by the French Freudians that Lasch used, of which Lacan was explicitly bracketed out. Like, and the other names are not as well known to even American psychoanalytics, unless they're very, very versed in psychoanalysis, because they are of schools that oppose Lacan, that Lacan even considered maybe too authoritarian. But it never made sense to me how Lacan became a darling for the left, because I'm like, one, he's really hard to read. Two, his relationship to Maoism was in no way organic, but I knew that French Maoism was important as kind of an alternative to Stalinism in kind of a similar way that Trotskyism in the Anglophone world became a kind of Marxist-Leninism that was not Stalin, for good and ill. And Mao, despite his, anti-revisionism in France, particularly around the Mao Spandexy realm of that, seemed to be a similar kind of figure there that he wasn't in the United States, really. But I could tell there was a direct relationship through that Badiou from Lacanism to Maoism. But knowing what I know about Chinese Maoism, that made no sense to me. Like right. It was just like, what happened in France that this psychoanalytic theory would pair up with, in the case of, getting into Althusser's deeper writings, it's very clear that like what he's engaging in is trying to like, I used to accuse him of mystifying Mao, and I used to accuse Badiou of being a Maoist Platonist, which I still think is true.
I think you agree with that. Actually, that's pretty good. Yeah. I think that the math, in a very simple way, I think that Lacanian mathemes, like that the Maoists see something of themselves there, like in this sort of embrace of like high formalism, like really, really abstract statements that have a sort of pseudo transhistorical validity in the, like, it is the Platonism itself that is Maoist.
Right. Go ahead.
No, that's where I was going. Yeah, go on.
The Platonism itself is Maoist. I'll let you pick back on that. I've always accused Maoist, or Mao, actually not Maoist, Mao in specific. Other Chinese communists are actually much better than this. But because he was writing for largely peasants, that he would make Hegelian statements and Marxist statements after he read them, which, by the way, Mao read Marx very late. He actually read Stalin, Lenin, Marx in that order, kind of the opposite order you normally read them. And but since he was trying to distill it down to some essence you could communicate to Chinese peasants, and I don't mean this in an Orientalist way, but it sounded to me like Taoist folk magic. And one of the things I've always said is it also reminds me of Platonism, because Platonism is in some ways a mystery school of ancient Greek religion. So like there is this rhyming statement. Now, I don't think Mao is that vulgar of a thinker, but Maoist slogans are. And that's,
right.
That's something that I found interesting in Badiou. But the other French Maoist, I mean, they're all over the place. Like, what they actually do with that doesn't look like. I mean, the one thing you can say is that, even if you're reading something like Carlos Garrido's Western Marxism that basically implies that this whole thing is a conspiracy by the CIA, which is kind of ludicrous. One thing you can say is that there is a way in which French Maoism is really divorced until post facto, honestly, about the divisions that emerge in Maoism in Latin America, in China itself. Like Mao Spondex is not that related to like Mao Zedong thought, a Mao Third Worldism, or Marxist-Leninist Maoism, etc. Like it feels very different. And yet understanding that seemed crucial to understanding how Lacan got in all this mess, and thus how Heidegger and Kojev all get incorporated into this worldview. Because Kojev is a statist thinker. He's kind of a Stalin, mildly sympathetic liberal, and Heidegger's Heidegger. I don't want to ad hominem him, but it is sort of like the philosophy of fascism and post-fascism. So how does that, even more than Nietzsche? I mean, I know we're on an anti-Nietzsche kick on the left right now after being on a pro-Nietzsche kick for like decades. But even more than Nietzsche, the incorporation of Heidegger into French theory always, and particularly from the Maoist variant, always baffled me. Like, what happened there? And your recounting gives me a link for why it would have happened. Because if you have these Maoist students of Lacan and it's a specific milieu, it's a little bit of like structural Mathian's appeal to Maoist thinking, and also a little greater and lesser contradictions and all that fun stuff.
It's important to. I think essential thing here is to remember that these are rationalists in search of axioms, right? Like a lot of this generation of French thinkers, many of them are sort of petty bourgeois provincials who've come to Paris. They are who have received like this a post-war or immediately pre-war education. They are thinkers in search of an axiom is really how I imagine these figures, and they use Mao as a jumping off point, as a place to begin, and they take as evidence, the Chinese miracle, or what they is seen in France as the Chinese miracle. They're in just the fact of the Cultural Revolution. I think why did Maoism take off in France and not in America? Just the proliferation of information and of propaganda about the Cultural Revolution and the excitement that it produced went directly to France, and then it came to America sort of via France, if that makes sense. But it is 68 is, I think, in France, and if you read accounts by some of the 68 intellectuals, they will say that we were directly inspired by what was happening in China. We saw what the students were doing there. We wanted it here. It was really, it's as simple as that, in a way, that it was this sort of moment of historical inspiration. We can spread this.
How much? Well, I mean, I know there is a historical relationship way predating this period in these schools between Asian communism and France. I mean, crucially, Ho Chi Minh and various of the more educated members of the Chinese Communist Party, although not Mao himself, had relationships to early French Marxism. The question that I have, though, is did they actually know that much about what was really going on in China? Did they have access? What do we know?
I mean, they had Maoist newspapers. They, they,
Got it.
they had the spectacle, like they had like this is a question that I think there's probably some really good
like
scholarship
leftists and Naxalites in the 90s, basically.
Yeah, it's really no, it is a it is, you know, to use Badiou's language in a way he would hate, it is a sort of pseudo event. Like the Cultural Revolution has experienced in France is like a sort of an event that is a failed event that is sort of not realized in the way that it is. Yeah.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, though, because then you have a critique of Stalin that can also get away from being called either left communism, which was also popular in France. I mean, we got to although, you know, as I mentioned earlier, all these ideas go weirder in France, and I don't mean to offend any my 5 French people who still listen to anything I say after I butchered everything they've ever said about themselves and completely destroyed their language. But it does seem to me that like there is something about the French milieu that is eclectic in a way that can be very productive, but also very dangerous.
So why do they? Yeah, like the question for me is always, why do you think that Heidegger can just be imported into your thought, like sort of ad hoc? Like, why do you think that this synthesis is even possible in the first place? That is, I think, a fundamentally French culture, like what would even be the word? A kind of arrogance that, like, you know, we can take this sort of this broken, disastrous system and produce something that is, you know, we can take the rational core of it, the functional core of it, and produce a leftist philosophy out of it, which is under debate and which was under debate even then. I mean, Deleuze is sort of an anti-Heideggerian, even though Foucault lived his life as a quasi-Heideggerian, and they had a close relationship, and their thoughts are almost undisentangleable and entangled. That's the word. Yeah. So, but why do they? I think it's part of it is just it's part of their intellectual tradition. These are, for the most part, professional philosophers. It's the power of the French Academy. Sartre is the only major figure this period who actually remains outside of the academy. I mean, he graduates from the École Normale, but he never becomes professor. He never becomes he never takes an official position within, at any university. I think he teaches lycée for a few years after his graduation, but then the war happens and he sort of never returns after he makes his career by his pen. But it's a feature of French intellectual life that to believe that these great thinkers are not fundamentally reactionary or otherwise. And people are going to yell at me for that. I'm sure that I'm going to get yelled at for saying that, but it feels to me accurate. God.
Accurate. No, I'm just going to chime in on this. I am a deep respecter of Nietzsche, who also really believes that Nietzsche is an utter reactionary.
It's hard to,
yeah. And I think Heidegger's an evil genius.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but this is again Heidegger. His formulations are so effective, two hand and at hand. The basic Heideggerian principles, like the ontic and the ontological. There's being and there's beings. These are such pure distilled concepts that it's hard to imagine where they will lead you one day. Which is why you need Hegel to sort of show you that, there is no such thing as an unembedded, and an apolitical and unhistorical concept, blah, 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 blah. But yeah, so yeah, I'm with you. Go on.
No. I mean, I'm there. So we have Althusser and Badiou, and in some ways, there's just anxiety, to use a Harold Bloom term. There's an anxiety of influence around Lacan and Lacanian psychoanalysis. There's also two other influences that are not uniquely French, but seem to be manifest in uniquely French ways, which is French phenomenology, which of course has a relationship to Hegel because, duh. For those of you who don't know, I mean, literally the book's, Hegel's most famous book is titled The Phenomenology of Spirit. And there's also French structural linguistics, which I get in trouble for just insisting, because people often will. One of my favorite corrections is when I talk about cognitivism. When I'm talking about cognitivism, people will confuse it with cognitive behavioral therapy.
Right.
But that French structural linguistics has largely been not abandoned, but kind of treated as actually the way that many psychiatrists will treat psychoanalysis, as a proto-science. Not as wrong per se, but based on assumptions that could not be overcome in the time period because of technological limitations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this feeling of structural linguistics, and then smack dab in the middle of that, and this is, something that you've written about. I actually was reading your piece on Roland Barthes today. You have French semiotics, which is kind of an interesting hybrid of structural linguistics with initially, like, Charles Sanders Peirce and American pragmatics and semiotics. So, which does explicitly get referenced in someone like Deleuze. I think people are always surprised that Deleuze was pretty well versed in American pragmatism. But
this is a whole secondary thing, is that one of Deleuze's teachers, Jean Val, he was the other guy who wrote on Hegel in the 20s. There's Kojève, there's Hippolyte, and then there was this other dude, Jean Val, and each of them read a different part of Hegel's as the center. And Val said that the unhappy consciousness is really the important part of Hegel. And what he did is that he said, like, if we take this feature of it, plug it into William James, and Val brought whole cloth James into the French Academy as a serious thinker, and not just as a kind of like cowboy Bergson, which is how he was read before, as this kind of like just American Bergson who didn't really know his philosophy, but had some, sick lines and good bits. But yeah, that's another kind of weird little bit of history. So that's where Deleuze got all of his pragmatism from. I mean, his first book, Empiricism and Subjectivity, is basically an attempt to turn Hume into William James. And his second book, Bergsonism, is his attempt to turn Bergson into Nietzsche, and then Nietzsche it's this sort of constant. It's like there's always a silent partner with Deleuze. I'm sorry. How the fuck do we get on this topic? I'm sorry.
No. I was mentioning the other anxious influences that make themselves in like French Marxism and French structuralism, particularly of the high theoretical camp, as opposed to like the formal Communist Party or the various sectarian groups that emerged post '68. So you have this. I have a question that maybe it has been looming this entire time, and it's a very direct question, so you must forgive it. But how the fuck did they become so important in America? Because one of the things about this is a lot of the stuff you need to contextualize this did not become important in America, or like Sartre, it is important, but not the part you need to put it all together.
Right. Film theory. I mean, the simple answer is that it becomes popular because film theory, and especially feminist psychoanalytic film theory, becomes such a major cultural force in America in the 70s and 80s. Like the mirror stage becomes popular as there's a few short essays. The Mirror Stage essay, Jacques-Alain Miller's essay on the suture, which is another sort of weird little proto-Maoist mathematizing gesture. Althusser on AI essays, all of that stuff, and Foucault, and all of that. These sources get kind of mashed together into this amorphous gunk that becomes the late 70s, early 80s version of film theory that we're still living with today, that gave us concepts like the male gaze, that gave us sort of like, not wrong, but sort of underbaked and vulgar versions of the French theory of ideology.
Right.
So short answer is that is their way into the academy. Derrida, there are, there's the Hopkins conference in the 60s where it's not just Derrida. That's the famous bit, is that Derrida was there, but Lacan was also there. A lot of other major structuralists were there. Levi-Strauss is, again, in vulgarized form, really important at the University of Chicago, and because they have Eliade. These are, Jungianism, structuralism is in some ways seen as a corrective and a scientific corrective to Jungianism. It's a respectable version of this thing that has kind of lived in the American Academy for too long, that is actually not respectable and and has serious right-wing connections. So there are these, none of that actually, it's sort of death by a thousand cuts. It seeps in through all of those openings, I think. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense. I mean, one of the things though I learned when I started actually learning about both modern French Marxism, I mentioned Closcard, who my friend Daniel Tutt is obsessed with right now, but also what was coming out of the CP, and I've also mentioned French Bourdigism and all that weird shit. It seems to me that there is a lot of that milieu that doesn't get brought to America, and particularly after after Bolivar's, do we really need the dictatorship of the proletariat, and Lyotard going full postmodern, and all that stuff. What you start to see emerging out of France is a kind of, not in the figures that I mentioned, not even in I wouldn't even call Baudrillard a right-wing figure, although I have in the past, but I don't really think that. I do think that the French Academy is not like these rock stars of the 70s Sorbonne that we in America brought over. And I know the Hopkins Conference and Stanford and all that stuff. I am actually where the American Institute of History, the University of Minnesota Press. Oh my God.
And and that stuff at U Minnesota, it was all one guy. It was one editor who just more or less single-handedly brought all of this material in. It's kind of, it's when you get down to the individual, for structuralists, I'm really into the individual, vulgar causal explanation, but sometimes they're the simplest ones. But there was money that was going through University of Minnesota, and there are people willing to buy this stuff, and but go on, sorry.
No, it definitely proliferated. And I don't think that's bad. Some of my favorite texts have been released by Semiotic, which is related to MIT and has a similar project. It's a few dudes bringing over weird French shit. But, it's interesting because even when, say, a lot of modern French academics encounter this stuff, it's kind of alien to them, too. The whole irony is what was it, Macron encountering CRT and being this is weird American perversion, and then being but they learned it from Foucault, dude.
Like Foucault is like in the Collège de France for 10 years. I mean, he was giving lectures from 70 to 80. Like this was like, he was in some ways, I mean, he would hate this term, but like he was sort of the court philosopher of France of the 70s. I mean, like to be lecturing, giving public lectures at the Collège de France there's no American equivalent to something like that. Like it is the center of French intellectual life in a way that.
Like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, your metaphor first.
No, I mean, I think about it like the only person I could think of even does, and this is not the equivalent of, speaking of the Collège de France, but like Michael Sandel at Harvard getting on the BBC and NPR and all that is like a 20th of what we're talking about. But that's the only thing I can think about that's really even kind of close. And partly because we inherited the British system and we're so stodgy about sharing this out, and these lectures were for the public, and they were kind of, I mean, it is always weird that when I'm trying to explain, to students when I was teaching university and talking about French theory, and I'm like, these guys were kind of rock stars, which is hard to like for us to like we don't really have academic rock stars in the humanities. Like,
I mean, Lacan walked around with bodyguards. Lacan had like a former Black Panther like guarding him with an Uzi, like driving him around. Like these are like, yeah, like they would get mobbed. Like they couldn't go to Dumago without getting fucking bothered. Like it's a weird, and it is a very weird relationship to the public, to the academy, to us. I think, how do I say this? I think that I don't know if it's a good, like, if it was good for them, if it was good for French intellectual life, if it was good for Foucault to sit at the Collège de France for 10 years. I don't know if that served him well as a thinker necessarily. I mean, but like The Order of Things, like his book from 55 was a bestseller in France. It sold like hundreds of thousands of copies. Like The Order.
That's a weird one to think of it.
Not even Discipline and Punish. Yeah.
Right. And not Discipline and Punish, not History of Madness, not the sexy ones, not the History of Sexuality. Yeah. The Order of Things.
The Order of Things. And he was sitting, and he was part of the prison group while he was giving the Collège de France lectures. He was participating in these demonstrations while he was also in this quasi-governmental, like this quasi-official, not governmental, but official position within like the French Academy, which has a complex relationship to the government. It is, I don't get it. Like, I mean, in a really simple, like, and I think that it's hard for me to wrap my head around how, like just what this did to the thought of these people. Like, not in the sense of like, oh, well, it made them all into just bourgeois apologists. Like, it didn't do that at all. Like, it made some of them weirder, and it made some of them like, they all had these complicated individual psychological overdetermined reactions to that scene. But like Kristeva, if you go back in the like archives of Le Monde, her dissertation defense was covered in Le Monde. It was like the cover of the cultural section, like the weekend cultural pages in 1970, whatever. That like Kristeva defends dissertation. Like, and her board was Bart. God, it was like 4 names you would know. Like it was the French cultural event of that like month was Kristeva's public dissertation defense. It's strange. Yeah.
So, I mean, that does seem to be one of the paradoxes of French Marxist theory, is that it is at the height of cultural power.
Mm-hmm.
It is incorporating elements from both internal and outside of France. They're trying to incorporate science, although, you know, if Elaine Sokol has anything to say about that, they tend to not understand the metaphors they use, or not realize they were metaphors. But nonetheless, you know, to defend the French post-structuralists for a second, that's also true of a lot of people, including physicists who don't understand what they're using metaphors. But I find this so fascinating because it ends up with, in America, like, we get Foucault, we get Deleuze, who are still darlings in the academy, and then Deleuze is the one that kind of rolls over into contemporary theory. There's been a turn against Derrida. I feel like there's been kind of a turn against Foucault, at least in social democratic circles. And Althusser and Lacan, however, seem to still loom. And Sartre does too, but as like a distant figure, probably you learned about in high school and don't understand. Like,
right. Yeah.
And I find that kind of strange. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, I'm sure you're familiar with Gabriel Rockhill. I'm familiar with Gabriel Rockhill. What do you make of his explanation of the importation of French theory as almost a way to suppress Marxism?
I think that I haven't thought directly about this idea in such a long time, because I just think it's so besides the point, because, like, who cares what they meant to do with it? You know, like if it was intentionally imported as a way to suppress Marxism, you know, great job, guys. Like, congratulations. Like, I don't think that anybody sitting at the CIA was like, you know, was like, we got to get me this Derrida guy on the line. Like, I just don't.
No, there's no smoking guns the way there is with some of the Frankfurt School. Although, again, even with the Frankfurt School, the ones that are the most connected to the CIA are the ones that were the most orthodox Marxists. So, are more orthodox, like Marcuse, and God, who's the others? It's not, but Horkheimer and Adorno have like
they work for
very little. They did, and they definitely had a relationship to the Congress of Cultural Freedom, but who didn't? Like,
yeah, no, I mean, it feels almost. This is what I mean. Like, this is why I think that those sort of, like, you know, the same thing can be said about the abstract expressionists. Like, okay, like Pollock got some government money, like, fucking,
yeah.
Like, what would you like me to do with that? Like, you know, it's not that, like it verges on conspiracy theory of history, which I think we're all, like, a little too old for, you know, like I'm willing to accept. Yeah.
Go ahead. Well, I mean, when I studied this stuff, like the program years, like I remember learning, the CIA started the MFA programs, and it's true that they did provide some seed funding money for it. And it's also true that they did that to, like, break up political artistic communities. But the CIA was also funding people who were protesting the MFAs. They were funding people who were denouncing them. They were kind of throwing money at everybody in academic institutions, period. Like, that's, you know, they weren't supporting Soviet Marxism. Absolutely true. Well, as long as we're talking about after 1947. And you know, and of course the CIA is later than that anyway, so you got to be dealing with the OSS and the Home Guard and all that stuff. But it's a weird reading to me, and it's also one that I'm always like, but why aren't you looking at, like, you know, what someone like Baudrillard or even Althusser said outright about what was going on in the French Communist Party? They weren't actually all that coy about it, like, about what they were responding to.
Right, and Althusser is sort of operating within the party, but in a kind of,
like internal opposition mode, kind of.
Yeah, like I mean, he's internal opposition, and also he thinks that, like, the ISA essay is basically an argument against the idea of primary and secondary contradictions, right? Like reading capital is if you get anything out of reading capital at all, it's that, this whole primary secondary contradiction thing is garbage, and that you can't declare from on high which is which, by the cunning of the dialectic, the secondary will become the primary at any given moment, etc. Like, no individual phenomena is an expression of the essence of the class struggle in a given time, blah, 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 blah. This is like, and the question then becomes like, okay, what do we do? What else do we do? Like, what if we don't, because from a theoretical perspective, that's perfectly fine. But like, how do you organize a praxis without at least some sense of primary and secondary? Like, what does it look like? And why does it not just become a kind of like Trotskyist, like eternal revolution, like endless cultural revolution thing?
Which it does for Badiou. Like, let's be quite actually.
Yeah. It becomes, the terror, capital T, in a kind of, but like, but Badiou goes on French state television like twice a week, like Badiou gives interviews to like, like with the little tagline, like Alain Badiou, like communiste philosophe, like it's a sort of, it's almost, I mean, I love him. He's a kind of a cuddly, like sort of wonderful old man now, and he's a great thinker and all that. And he but
he's a very idiosyncratic thinker. But I do, of the French writers that we've talked about, my favorite to read, other than Bataille, because he's crazy.
Have you read his plays? Badiou, have you ever read Badiou?
Some of his plays. I actually have read some of his plays, yeah. And I've read a lot of his literary criticism, which I find weirdly idiosyncratic, but like, kind of good. I mean, it's it was interesting to me. It's also interesting to me that Badiou took so much longer to become important in the U.S. Like, of the figures that, because he's younger, but he's contemporaneous to a lot of the people we're mentioning. But it wasn't until the Slovene School got popular that people were really talking about Badiou in the United States. Like,
it was because of Zizek. I mean, really, It was because of Zizek's engagement with him in one of those books from the 90s, the title of which I'm forgetting. Yeah. And it was also Badiou's own critique of Deleuze. Which
is the first thing I read by Badiou, actually.
Which is probably one of the worst things he ever wrote. Yeah,
right.
Because it's but and that Deleuze, that sort of Deleuzians encountered and then endlessly strawmanned, and responded. One thing a Deleuzian will always do is respond to like a bad critique with an even worse like response. It's almost but yeah. Why didn't Badiou become popular more soon? I mean, the easy answer is that like it's really fucking hard, man. It's really like like it is austere. It is like the neologisms accumulate around one another. So much of the important work. I mean, I prefer theory of the subject. Theory of the subject, especially the work that he does on Mallarmé in that book, is just absolutely extraordinary.
I was about to say that's the book by Badiou I like the most, and I don't mind the Logic of Worlds and all that series, but like I love the early theory of the subject, even though I had to figure out what the fuck he meant by scission. Like,
spliced.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, but like so much of that stuff. I mean, but those were given as lectures. I mean, those were seminars, public seminars that he gave, right? Like, and it's the form in which they were given. I mean, like, there are many, I don't know when the last of Foucault's Colors de France lectures came out, but it was recent in English. There are Lacan seminars that are not yet even available in French, that like Miller is just, I don't know, like what he's doing instead, other than editing these Lacan seminars. But I know that there are like, I think at this point, 3 or 4 that are still just not available in any language. Like it's
the fact we still get new Foucault actually baffles me.
Yeah, really, yeah, it's yeah, but no, I think, yeah. God, I have no good answer for why Badu has become popular, and I think it had something to do also with Heart and Negri and that moment.
Yeah.
And what the Italian autonomists did with the event as a concept, which is to say, like, completely empty it of any rigorous theoretical content. But like, that's fine. Like, I mean, like, the autonomists are cool and fun, and like Hart and Negri were important for that 8-year period between 9/11 and the financial crash. And I mean, it was an important sort of little adventure for the American left to take that some people are still on. And, we're just waiting for them to come back around.
A lot of people who are still on are like, don't even know they're on it too. Cause I'm like, once you get all the autonomous verbiage in there, it's basically populism. Like,
yeah. Yeah, no, it's really, no, I mean, because like and I think that the reason that autonomism took off in this country is because we never had, like the British, a serious sort of, again, I'm going to get yelled at, but like we never had a sort of highly embedded Trotskyism, like a great tradition in the way that they have in England.
I would slightly disagree, but I would say that the issue is by 1980 that tradition is dead in America, and that from the 1990s forward we just claim the British tradition as our Trotskyism. Like that's what we ended up doing. But I would also say, like, the issue that you have is American Trotskyism either gets very, very, very suspiciously pro-Cold War around, like, say, Shachtman and co., or it becomes in some ways almost indistinguishable from Marxist-Leninism, but just like maybe Stalin bad sometimes. Like, and by that I mean you can see that in the Marcyites that became the WWP and the PSL. You can see that sometimes in the Sparts and their critical support for like pretty much everybody. You can see that in the Kamehoites, who are Trotskyists who try to reconcile themselves with Maoists. Like it's, and so its tradition had hollowed out, whereas the British tradition's like been staunch and is tied to both his own historical parties and the Labour Party in a way that, like, we just don't have anything like that. Like, in some ways, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but like, the American Trotskyist legacy is the Teamsters, and then the Teamsters, instead of staying with the 27th, 4th International, end up like flirting with the mob and Nixon. So like, I don't know, what you do with that. Like,
yeah, no, I mean, like the IWW and the sort of like, I mean, like the autonomists actually take the International Workers of the World and like Big Bill Haywood and a lot of these figures as kind of like, one big union, general strike. Like these are all kind of revitalized figures, and I credit like Hart and Negri produced like a lot of historical interest in these figures, got people like got these books back into print indirectly, like got people interested in that American Marxist / anarchist tradition. People are, all that, like that Hart and Negri stuff is kind of on the way down, like, you know, and I think people are too hard on it. I think we've gone too far in the other direction because
shitting on empire and all that's become like a regular thing for Marxists to do.
It's so fucking boring, man. I mean, like, I get it, like, you know, the Iraq War protest didn't work, like Occupy failed, but it's not because like Hart and Negri didn't write a good enough book. It's because like, you know,
right.
like,
well, I mean, also like it's not like American Marxist-Leninism has a strong history of success either, except for liquidating into the Democratic Party. So, you know, or American, you know, like the high point of American of the efficacy of, like, say, American commentary on like communism is during the third period, because we can't work with the Democrats. But that's not the high point of recruitment. The high point of recruitment is immediately after World War II. So it's and then it collapses. I mean, like, these groups collapse so fast it's hard to see straight. And for reasons of both Cold War politicking and also their effect on American life, the Trotskyists in America were more studied. I mean, frankly. And, you know, after the thawing of the 60s, you could probably get away with being I mean, you get away with being a Marxist-Leninist in America if you were quiet about it, but you could definitely get away with being a Trotskyist even if you were obnoxious about it. So it's, these things are interesting, but I mean, I do admit part of the reason why I brought up the Rikos thing is I agree with you. I think it's a little bit too close to a pat conspiracy theory of history, and also it makes the CIA way more effective than my studies of the CIA seem to indicate that they are. But I do think it is at least inconvenient that this stuff spreads like wildfire after the new communist movement stalls out, and it kind of makes sense why, because the new communist movement in America was also highly Maoist. I mean, like, but it was a more, I mean, it was a more, I want to say vulgar, but it was a less intellectualized form of Maoism. Like, the Panthers are, you know, not writing like anything like you're seeing out of the Reading Capital group. Like, that's, you know, and it's not to say that there weren't intellectuals there. There definitely were, but they weren't aiming at that kind of milieu at all. And so it's interesting to think about how that all went and why it might seem like this was a way of de-radicalization, particularly when you add to it the effect of post-Marxism and you know, people like Foucault and Baudrillard and these people who had critiques of Marxism, some of which, frankly, I mean, some of Baudrillard's critiques of Marxism have always struck me as just bad. Like, they're not, like, they're very superficial readings of what's going on. And I was not sympathetic to him at all until I read a lot of the texts that have come out more recently about his, like, personal response, like the Divine Left and all that stuff, about his personal responses to the Mitterrand government and the Communist Party around that time. In which case, a lot of the theoretical stuff all of a sudden were contextualized in a way it's like, oh, I get why he's mad now. Like, and that's one of the things with a lot of these French thinkers is that, with a few rare exceptions, they seem to be presented. I mean, Badiou's one of them because he's still alive, but they seem to be presented to students totally decontextualized. Like, you know, when I was taught Foucault, I would have thought at first the main thing he had to say was the death of the author. You know, like,
right.
You know, like,
yeah.
You're sitting in a undergraduate seminar and you're taught that, like,
right. Yeah, no, it's especially Foucault. I think he suffers the most from this sort of thing. You know, I mean, like, I didn't know I read Discipline and Punishment without knowing that he was actually engaged in actual prison struggles. Like,
Right.
you know, like nobody told me that he was, you know, like, I mean, I remember, but then that goes in a lot of different ways. I mean, I remember reading Dialectic of Enlightenment, not knowing that it was written in exile. Like,
Right.
you know, like it's just this, it's a
And
problem.
the common translation of Dialectic of Enlightenment is, it's the common translation of Negative Dialectics. It's real shit. But go ahead.
Oh, that's a fucking CIA op right there. It's like to make Adorno fucking incomprehensible. Like it's, oh God, you know,
and to like there's Karl Korsch quotes in that Adorno book that aren't even attributed in the common translation. It's fucking infuriating. Anyway, go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I mean,
you tell I actually know more about German than France.
No, I mean, why are they? I think that there's finally now pushback against it. I mean, because so much of this of the French theory, the way that it comes in through English departments and through comparative literature departments. You are taught it in a particular way, which is, you know, you are going to deploy this theoretical framework on some text. You don't engage as an undergraduate directly with the theory almost ever. You are told to use the concepts as tools to deal with Jane Austen, whatever the fuck, you know,
right.
Like, and that's a pedagogical problem. That's you barely learn, I mean, how to read the philosophy itself, let alone how to read it in light of its sort of material conditions, because it's always seen in a functional relationship to something else in the classroom. I mean, you experienced that.
I was thought of it as a toolbox. Like I was literally told that, and they would find like Deleuze quotes to justify it, but it was just like, it's a toolbox, and you just kind of pick from the tool set, and then like you write a paper, and you're done. And which to me is like, the more I learned about this theory, even you know, you probably heard me talk about this because I've talked about it now for like fucking 14 years. But my first experience with Althusser was coming out of a seminar on Faulkner and critical theory, being given Lenin and philosophy, told read it, explain it to the class, and then go teach it to your undergrads about how to use ISAs and RSAs to interpret I don't know, fucking Toni Morrison. And
yeah, man, it's fucking brutal because they don't. And then, you know, and it's taught by, you know, it's taught by professors who got their Althusser through film theory to graduate students who then go and, you know, read it the morning before they teach it to undergraduates. Like, of course, and nobody has any philosophical context, let alone historical context through which to work this stuff. Like nobody said the word Kojève to me until I was in graduate school. And let me tell you, I read a lot of fucking French theory in undergrad. And like nobody told me that all these fuckers were together in the same room listening to this one weirdo give one incredibly heterodox reading of Hegel that they all borrowed and massacred. You know, like none of that, the institutional context. And I think that a big part of it, of why I don't do it in my own classes, is often because I worry that if I explain the historical context too much, the cynical brain of a 19-year-old will say like, oh, so this is all like bullshit. Never mind. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's a productive pedagogical mystifying that is done to get buy-in from students that, oh, this is something that is useful, that I can use, you know, because I find that when I try to historicize these and contextualize these theorists, what it often does is the kids disengage. Either because they're bored, which is totally possible, or because they say like, oh, so this is just some guy who had some thoughts. Like, I don't care. Like, you know, like this is a problem with the American education system, really, is that we do so much mystifying that any attempt to demystify then turns us into cynics. Or then and you end up in a kind of long dark night of the anti-intellectual soul, and that's, this is a pedagogical problem. Sorry, what?
No, which I might call media theory today. Anyway, I'm just sniping at my ideational enemies. It's I think you're right, though. I mean, to talk about this in terms of teaching, I also find that like we tend to teach. The way I was taught critical theory almost was like it was a toolbox to look at papers. Then when you meet someone passionate about it, number two, it becomes like, I don't know, a mystical religion that I can use to see through the bullshit of the bourgeois world, right? Which it's not really that good at. And I can do it by really understanding one thinker. Like if I double down on Baudrillard, I'll get it all. I'll understand the simulacra and I'll get through it. And the funny thing about me is I had a philosophy and anthropology background too. I was doing that training, but I was trained by conservative Hegelian Straussians in analytics in philosophy. So I had no, like, for example, to bring up overdetermination. When I hit overdetermination and Althusser, I was like, well, that just means multiple causes. Who the fuck cares? Right? Because that's what it means in analytic philosophy. Like, it has a meaning.
And to be fair, that is in some way, that is in a very, abstract sense what it means in Althusser. But like,
it's not totally wrong.
And the only way that it becomes useful is if you understand it against the context of primary and secondary, contradictions. This is, if you understand it against the sort of damage wrought by that theoretical position. Yeah. Like in the same way that, say, like, it's not just that I was meaning to say this earlier. It's not just that the French intellectuals of the 60s are anti-Stalinist. Like, it's that there are particular events that occur that disillusion them. Like Hungary in 56 is Sartre's falling out in many ways with, I know this specifically. I know, like, 56 in Hungary is when Sartre realized that he needs to remake Marxism, is that he needs to rebuild and produce a new kind of official Marxism. And that's when he undertakes the project. It's also when he starts doing a shitload of mescaline. And starts hallucinating a bunch of crabs that are chasing him around. Have you heard this story?
Yeah.
I mean, and then that's also prompts him to go talk to Lacan. Is that, is the crab hallucination. So, it's this endless, but it's, and at some point when you're in a classroom, you have to decide how specific do I have to get here? Like, can I just assign them like one Stalin essay and be like, everybody's mad about this. Like, everybody is mad about, like, Stalin's short course. That is that against which they have to position themselves without naming it. Like, I was told how many times in graduate school, whenever you see Hegel, think Stalin. Like, whenever you see Hegel and Althusser, just think Stalin. And that is true in a vague, vulgar sense, but then you take another step and you say, well, no, think Kojève. And then you have to think, how does that association get developed, et cetera? Does this make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I kind of know this history a little bit.
Pedagogical problem. What?
Yeah. No, I just said I kind of know this history of it, so I can follow you. But, like, yeah, I mean, it's a huge pedagogical problem. And I think the way we teach critical theory, and I'm going to even throw the New Left Review under the bus a little bit here, because the Marxist attempt to use this stuff invented a category that was first used as a slur against Soviet and Marxism unfairly. Western Marxism was superior to Eastern Marxism, right? That's Perry Anderson's basic gambit. Later on gets reverted by Lacerdo and, later on even more vulgar people in America to be like, aha, but you screwed up the true Chinese and Soviet Marxism, although we're not going to mention the Sino-Soviet split in there and just pretend that none of that happened. Very convenient, which is also something you have to understand what the fuck is going on in France, or even in America, because that's what splits up the CPUSA beginning in the late 50s. Like, the response to what's going on in China is what starts the fragmentation of Marxist-Leninism in America. And so even when we tried to get away from this, like, okay, let's say you encounter this in sectarian Marxist world, like you were in the ISO, right? And the ISO was like, trot, but we like Althusser sometimes, so, we'll throw it at you. Particularly because Alex Kalinikos and the British liked Althusser for reasons that are beyond me. And not that someone liking Althusser is beyond me, but why a Trotskyist would is a little bit beyond me.
Yeah, that's really, that is, okay, yeah. And
so, that's why there's so many Althusserian texts in both Haymarket and Verso books. I mean, like, it's but that you get this tradition even when you come at it through sectariana that is positing a false break between Western and Eastern Marxism, as this Eastern Marxism is just Stalin or just Stalinist or whatever, and in some, yes, it's all Marxist-Leninist, but there's actually interesting thinking going on in Hungary and in the DDR and in the Soviet Union, even there, like Vygotsky and Vygotsky and Bakhtin and Medvedev, and all those, Medvedev is dead by that point, but all those people are actually quite interesting. You don't get any of that, right, if you posit this binary where there's just official Soviet Marxism, which we're also bracketing all these other interesting thinkers out because they're not easily reconcilable with official Soviet Marxism, even though they're totally in that system. And Western Marxism, of which the French and the Frankfurt School are made to represent it, and also in a way that even distorts the history of like what the sectarian left was like in France and Germany, because that's kind of bracketed out. And the only people you get kind of a better idea of what's actually going on reflected in the theory is the Italians, because they come over late. Like,
right. That's really good. Yeah.
And so it's that. And even then, the reason why we get Hart and Negri is because Hart and Negri are hanging out. I mean, not Hart so much, but Negri's hanging out in France in the 70s because he's in exile. So, like, right. Or the 80s, excuse me.
Contributed to assassinate the prime minister.
Yes, I mean,
we really forget about that too. Man, nobody told me about that for like a year after I read Empire for the first time. Like, it's unbelievable. This, nobody told me that Guattari was in the Red Brigades. Like, it's baffling.
Oh yeah, Guattari's in the Red Brigades, and then he was a Trotskyist for a little while. Like, no, like I learned that way later. I was like, what? Like, this guy doesn't read like any former Red Brigade turned Trotskyist I've ever fucking read. Like, also, that's not normal. I mean, people make hay out of like the end of Althusser's life, like the philosophy of the encounter, which is some of his most interesting work, but he's also clearly like lost it. And when I would get mad at Althusser, I would call him the Paris Strangler, but like, it's funny how little this context you get. And when you do get it, oddly, it often comes from like right-wing denunciations. Like, how many books have the right written about what Foucault was up to? And then later, social democrats are like, Foucault like kind of like neoliberalism for 35 seconds, and so he's bad.
Don't get me started on Tunisia.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's like all the sort of the slander of Foucault in Tunisia, and what was he really up to? It's just it doesn't even bear mentioning because it's like it's so. But you know,
yeah, but I mean, like the fact that, go ahead.
No, but this is what I mean is that like the question of how much context do you give? How much context do you give? I mean, like how can I'm like Jesus Christ, I'm trying to teach this. I can't even get these kids to read, a 6 pages of a short story. Like, I'm not going to explain to them how Algeria like affected French intellectual life. Like, it's just, like the pedagogical problem just never. And I don't think maybe it's the beginning of the semester. I'm not teaching this semester, thank God, but it's on my mind. And maybe this is why I keep coming back to this, but I don't think that we can underrate how, important that is for the American reception of all this stuff. It's just like we do not have an educational system that is capable of shouldering the burden of our own history, let alone that of that of continental Europe. It's just not, it's.
No, I'm not only with you on this, but as a person who thought that we could intervene in that with stuff like podcasts, what I've seen in like the philosophy and breadtube world, and then in like RedTube and and all that, it isn't very. It doesn't help much either. Like, and even when it's people who kind of know what they're talking about, like you're listening to academics. It's often still kind of muddled. And, and today I'm just going to say, like, I know that people are going to hear this and they'll be like, you guys are talking about everything. And like, yet I'm going to have trouble following the thread here. Like, I know that's going to be thrown at us, and that's fine. The thing that I think that I want people to get when we talk about this is, this does matter beyond of its effect on the American Academy, but it did also have a particular effect on the American Academy. But our view of it, because of that, is distorted. But I don't think the sectarian views of it help you either. Like, it's like, if I go to Perry Anderson or I read, I don't know, Kasama Project 10 years ago complaining about how Badiou is not a true Maoist enough, but which form of true Maoism we're not even going to talk about. Like, it's not like there's like 70 forms of that. Or if I encountered today, like, Midwestern Marx before they got on the American Communist Party train, like, complaining about, how all this was probably a conspiracy to not truly appreciate the Soviet Union, but without mentioning the Sino-Soviet split, are mentioning it only directly, and only by glossing Dungist talking points and not even going into the Chinese context, and then not mentioning the problems in the French Communist Party, etc. And in many ways, it actually ends up being a weird mirror world of the same problem that we had discussing this in academia, except now it's even more explicitly biased because we're dealing with people who have, sectarian points of view. And I also have a sectarian point of view. I am a sectarian of one, but still I have it. It's something that I think really limits our ability to understand this. And ironically, John, my experience with Kojève was on the right. And so I knew Kojève because of his debates with Strauss and Strauss's debates with Carl Schmitt. Right. I didn't know that was looming behind all this French shit in a very particular way until I think I was 32 years old. And it was actually doing research for a podcast, like I was a fucking graduate student teaching a class, trying to figure out, where's Althusser's Hegel coming from? Where's this instat shit coming from? I don't remember any of that in Hegel. Oh, I remember learning about the Kojève Hegel lectures and his debates with Karl Strauss. Holy shit! This is a missing link for me, right?
Yeah.
But
Like, holy shit, this is
luck.
an entire what?
That was just luck. Like,
yeah,
so,
no, I mean, like, and there's something to be said about that way of encountering the history. I mean, like, what would an official kind of like thorough accounting of all of this even look like? Like, how do we, like, not to be overly Deleuzian about it, like, you know, but like, how, like, what would an official discourse on this look like that is sectarian in the right ways, i.e. agrees exactly with everything that I think, and like sets you up to agree with the thinkers I agree with? You know, like, how does we can't tell people the story from, you know, from point A to B to C, for the obvious reasons. But what you can do is prepare them to encounter this stuff, to know where to look and to know how to look at it. And that is what so much of like this like current like, you know, left ecosystem on like YouTube and shit, like, just does not prepare you to do. Like, it's just like, it is antithetical to a lot of that shit. Like, to actually like preparing you to encounter something on your own terms. Right. I mean, and not on your own terms, but on its own terms, which are, you know, enfolded inside, like, you know, like, but then again, that becomes quickly very abstract. Like, and
go ahead.
I think about this a lot, like, as, you know, being, you know, formerly a teacher, now in publishing, like, what is your responsibility? You know, like, what does a responsible pedagogy and a responsible kind of like presentation of this information look like? And I mean, like, it's
really fucking hard. I mean, and basically my way of getting people through it is similar to yours, in that you approach it in the, you know, that old Buddhist parable of feeling the elephant blindly and figuring out each piece at a time. Because, you know, I can think of books that I've been really proud to publish. Many of them are from sectarian standpoints that I probably oppose. Like, there's a lot of, like, I was really big on publishing some orthodox Maoist stuff that I thought was really good on contextualizing what happened to Maoism in America and Latin America in the 1980s. And it actually made it clear that it was a different thing than what was going on in China, and that they were both in dialogue with each other, but they were also in tension with each other. And this created a bunch of ideological tendencies that do have effects, because they affected the new left and the new communist movement later. Even like these people were picking the stuff up when they were in academic careers in the 80s and early 90s. And some of them kept some of this stuff even when they quit being Marxist. So it's something that I try to prepare people for. But I'll be honest with you, I didn't learn that. Like, I learned how to chunk and all this from teaching. I will also say, pedagogically, my interview style is almost the opposite of what I would do if I was teaching just directly, which is like long, discursive, deliberately rambly, so that people feel comfortable and get more stuff out there and people can pick up the threads. So for those of you who wonder why I interview the way I do, and often also front load so things and talk so much, part of that's just my personality. But part of that is also because I think, you know, you're not on the interview circuit, but I'm sure you've listened to The Dig or some of these like more standard, almost NPR-ish left to far left podcast, right? There's a way of presenting in them, and also a kind of playing to the talking points of an academic or activist that makes them very samey after a while. And also, like often I can predict exactly what's going to be said, and not just because I know the topics. It's because like there's that people are not even realizing how much they're in a genre structure.
Right.
But I'll tell you, you know, and I'm going to sound like a fucking old man because I kind of am. But I'll tell you some of the most disheartening things to me when I present this stuff. So I had some smart high school students who found my work, which I would normally have a heart attack about because we live in Utah.
Everything, yeah.
But they didn't really engage with it because they told me, well, it was really interesting, but I can't watch a video that's longer than 5 or 6 minutes most of the times, unless it's like watching a video game playthrough.
Mm-hmm.
And these were honor students, and I was like, oh my god, like,
No, dude, I have had, man, oh god, I have had very intelligent college students ask me for. This is maybe one of the most disheartening moments of my academic life. Is I had an extremely smart, extremely engaged student, and end of the semester was like, give me some reading recommendations. Give me some stuff to for over the summer, like names, people, who should I look at? I'm interested in these things. And I've, spent about an hour typing up like, here's 7 books with like summaries and names and editions and all this shit. And he sends me an email back basically being like, oh, I didn't mean books. Can you give me like, YouTube interviews maybe, or like YouTube lectures about stuff? And it was just fucking, it hurt because it's just like, not because I was upset with this kid, not because I felt rejected or negative to her, but it's just like, Jesus, like, we're fucked. If that's how, like, one of the smartest kids I've ever taught and this is a college student, is approaching like something that he actually cares about, like I'm like in, like, this is like the 2020 moment, and like, like involved in like getting his feet wet in activist groups and stuff. And if there's somebody actually gives a shit and they're telling me I can't read a book like over the summer when I don't have a job or anything else to do, like, I don't know what the fuck I'm gonna like. It's like, I sound like an old man too, but like, this is part of the point of like that fucking Substack, which I'm not plugging, but like, it is, it's like there is I'm not comfortable with the idea that like that this should be easy. Like, it's not easy. Like, I mean, an unbelievable amount. You have like an incredible capacity for recall that I envy deeply of like the global political situation. That is not a talent I have. Like, I have read a lot. I have retained such a tiny amount of it, and it's humiliating. And I think of my students who have read maybe 2% of that and recall even less. And it makes me feel sick, like physically sick. Like, oh
yeah. I mean, it makes me sympathetic to Plato of thinking maybe we shouldn't have ever written anything down and just made people memorize everything. But I'm kidding, kind of. So it is concerning, and it makes dealing like. I remember I was reading not Russell's Jacobi. Was it Russell's Jacobi or Richard Sennett? The Fall of Public Man and the Decline of Public Intellectuals. Both those books. So I think one's a Richard Sennett book and one's a Russell Jacobi book. And I was reading them when I was teaching. I was teaching at a college and a high school simultaneously in South Korea. And at the time, I was pushing back on massive online learning because it was like bullshit. But also, I was excited for the fact that I started seeing theory in blogs, like, and seeing these people, like academics around, your position in your career, my position at that time and mine, who were not really able to fully get their stuff out there, to the public, realizing that if they played the citation game, that no one was going to ever fucking read anything they wrote, because maybe 5 people read what you publish in an academic article, beyond the peer review board. And maybe sometimes it's just that and like one guy. You know, and so they realized that, and they were doing these blogs and they were presenting this theory. But what I saw immediately, and my own work, I feel like I contributed this in my early phase when I was working early on with Doug Lane, was in trying to make this stuff the 101 level. No one ever got past the 101 level. Like, we were just doing that over and over and over again. And it also was stunting my own growth. Like, I myself was not growing because I'm not teaching to the next step. Now, I'm a big believer, like, you know, teach the basics till you know it backwards, forwards, and sideways, right? Like, but for your own intellectual edification, you also need to be pushing yourself to do more and more and more all the time. And I know I come off as an academic elitist, and I want people to, like, think about this. I'm not. Like, I rejected getting my PhD actively. Sometimes I think about it, then I, like, bash myself in the face because no one I know with a PhD is happy. Sorry, bro. And and I, particularly in the humanities, some of the scientists are happy, but we don't know. Do scientists feel happiness? I'm fucking around, people. I'm joking. So my response seriously was like, well, we have a bunch of people who are really craving this stuff, but they also don't have the skills to engage it. And then it's being pushed out to the general public. Like, people encounter Deleuze and Hegel and Marx and shit. And I don't think this is bad, but like through memes.
Through memes. Yeah, no, I mean, and they encounter it in a kind of, I mean, it's in a kind of like narcissistic fascination way of like, know what that means, know what that means, I know what that means. Like, and I mean, like, I think that this was, and it's so easy to get arrested at that exact point, like to know just enough to like understand, like you feel that if you understand what each of these individual little floating signifiers is gesturing towards, if you can follow the path of the gesture, then you understand the theory, and then suddenly you can like weigh in on things. And I blame Catholicism and 14 years of Catholic school on my part for proving to me that that is not the case. Like, that is not like what it means to be educated. And there is a, you know, and I think that most people understand that on a kind of abstract level, but God damn it, it's hard, man. It's like hard to sleep 5 hours a night because you spent, you know, because you spent all your good time after dinner reading. Like, it's just hard. Like it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. Like, I get why people don't do it, you know, but there's a lack of, I've noticed this in my students, and I notice it in pretty much anybody under the age of 25 that I encounter, is a lack of capacity to deal with frustration, to deal with not understanding something, a kind of almost terror that accompanies any sort of like, I don't know what that means. I don't know how to respond to this. I don't know how to feel about this. Like, it's this intense anxiety that is also born in the classroom, that the teacher wants, is that makes the teacher uncomfortable, and then you want to rip the kid out of that by just explaining it simply and moving on with your life and letting them move on and getting them out of that bad affective place. You know, I mean, you encounter this and every day in the classroom is a battle to like make them sit in that bad place a little bit longer and tolerate it a little bit better. And this is exactly like, I mean, and then suddenly the classroom starts to look a lot like the clinic. Like, this is what one of the insights of analysis is, like, how do you allow the analysand to suffer in a safe way, to like bring themselves to the point of discomfort, to express like, you know, to express thoughts that frighten them without disintegrating psychically. And I think for a host of media-related reasons and, pedagogical reasons and cultural reasons, like, we are really at a point where we cannot tolerate frustration in even the way that I could 10 years ago, of just like sitting with the 1844 Marx manuscripts in my freshman seminar in college and just being like, what the fuck? Like, what is a dialectic? Like, how do, like, what do you, like, what is, like, tracing the subjective and the objective? Like, I was just looking at my, Marx and Engels reader from college the other day, like, kind of nostalgically, like, all of, like, every single word underlined twice, like, and remembering just the state of confusion, like, that I was in, that, like, that felt almost just that felt like thrilling, but also terrifying. Like, there's so much I don't know. Holy shit. There's an entire, like, there's so much I don't know. And I don't know how to make somebody want to put themselves in that position, because you never have to.
No.
Yeah.
But
sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. But it's one of those pedagogical things that you first tell someone that's like, the first step of being an ignorant jackass is that it's a comfortable place to be, because you are incompetent, but you are unconscious of your incompetence. Like, the hardest place is the 2 steps before you reach mastery, where you know that you can do it, or you can't, right? But you have to actively think about it, and it's painful, and it brings up cognitive dissonance, and it brings up discongruities with prior beliefs, and. Now, some of this I blame on the education system. I blame it on the way we teach. As a person who's been teaching for 17 years, watching standardized testing. Actually, though, I will defend testing a little bit, because what replaces it is actually often worse, which is just holistic bias control. But I also think it's the media environment. It's the ridicule if you're ever wrong. And what it's lead to on the left is superficial views of complicated theories, a refusal to take a risk with the theories because some jackass graduate student, no offense, will point out where you missed something from the 3rd book one day because that's their specialization. And I welcome that, even so sometimes I'll make fun of those people. But I do welcome it, because that's how you grow. And lastly, and I think this is one of the harder things to deal with, is that this leads to guru formations way more than cults of personality, like the classical style.
Oh, yeah.
But just people who just assert even sometimes, like, plainly contradicting the text they're asserting about in ways, if you just read it, you would immediately know.
Right.
This is endemic right now. And that makes understanding something is, frankly, somewhat deliberately arcane. Thank you, College of France, for making neologisms a big part of French academia that is not in any other society ever, because they'll just use other people's words. But I do think that it makes something like approaching French theory in a way that you don't treat it as a guru form. Like, Lacan is going to answer all my questions.
Right.
Like, and you don't treat it as a total waste of time, or like, oh, these are just French obscurantists. It doesn't fucking matter. Go learn some real science. I think both those responses are more likely given the conditions we've been talking about for the last 15, 20 minutes. And that's really unfortunate, given also how prevalent this shit is in our society. I mean, it is hard for me to imagine, even though I'm completely aware that half the people who read Empire when it was one of the top selling books in the United States, which it was, just wild
awesome.
to me.
Crazy.
Like,
the dude,
it's like that and no
professor
longer,
and
like,
the dude who like assassinated the Italian prime minister, man. Fucking
yeah, I mean, like, it is fucking wild to me that book in particular, because it's not an easy read, was New York Times bestseller, up there with No Logo by Naomi Klein, and which is one of the better Naomi Klein books I'm gonna add, and Chomsky's media theory, and Chomsky, like it's like almost impossible to imagine that now, but you do see that people still, I mean, maybe even more now, still have a craving for this, but they don't have the capacity to engage in it. And I'm going to use a literary term. I try not to use literary terms on my show. I try to like not play up the fact that I'm actually pretty knowledgeable in literary theory, but like they don't have the negative capacity for the incongruence that some of the stuff and the ambiguity that some of the stuff will bring up in you. Like, is Althusser all good or all bad? That's a stupid fucking question. Like it's just like what, and it's like, how do you understand it? Once you understand it and can contextualize it, then you can decontextualize it. Then you can go through and figure out what is useful. Because if you don't do that, you haven't contextualized it, you don't know what you're bringing in, and you don't know what downstream effects that may have. And then, we all have to, the last bit of this I'll say is we all have to put this in a materialist context. What are people's incentives for doing this, and why would they do it? And like, there's a lot of incentives to be theoretically adroit in a superficial way right now. And as I've said a couple of times, sometimes I'd rather you not be theoretically adroit at all, and just, I don't know, go join a fucking union or something, than you be theoretically adroit badly. Like, it's one of those situations where like a little bit of knowledge may actually be worse than no knowledge. Like, it's and again, I know that can sound elitist, but like, I read Nietzsche in high school, like a good weirdo, and and I read Sartre in high school and Camus in high school, and I read Camus as a 14-year-old. And before you guys think, oh, you must be middle class, motherfuckers, my dad was a mechanic. My mom hadn't even started college yet. She was a night waitress. It was just something that passed the time because books were cheap in the library. Like, and it would keep me from doing drugs. Like, that was sort of my modus operandi, guys. Like, so I find this problematic. Another lefty thing is like, oh, the workers couldn't learn this. Bullshit. No, they don't have much of incentive to learn it.
That is the single most offensive bit of it. Like, like this is not, this is pretentious. This is above the worker. This is like, it's like, fucking brother, Marx wrote Capital for the workers. Engels called it the Bible of the working class for a fucking reason, because
it had untranslated Greek in it.
It's absolutely no. Like, but this is like also like, this is, I think, the good part of the kind of the fascination, not guru syndrome necessarily, but the sort of like the stages of like, so many people have the encounter with like some initial encounter with a mysterious text that kind of gets the motor turning, gets them to think that there's something going on here. I mean, for me, it was like, it was Freud, actually. Like, I mean, was the figure that got me totally fascinated. I read Freud when I was 14 for the first time, because I was seeing my father died, and I was seeing a like school psychiatrist, and I was going 3 days a week, and he was a kind of this old man named Dr. Ralph, and he, I had this plan that I was going to I was going to anticipate what he was going to say to me, and I was going to prove that it was all bullshit, and that, that I didn't need therapy action. I was fine. And fuck you, Dad. But so I read Freud in advance. I started making up dreams to tell him about, and he would be like, that's really interesting. Oh, it sounds like you're having some, you know, like it was this like, but I got along the way of that, you know, I mean, totally a transferential relationship, you know, but along, like I became completely enamored with this, you know, the idea that there are logics of connection between thoughts that are not conscious, that like that you are led from one thought to another for reasons that you cannot explain, and that felt to me, and I got more and more into this sort of, and that led me to the surrealist, and that led me to like, you know, every text would involve some name somewhere that would put me somewhere else, and that kind of like, you know, what Deleuze would call it rhizomatic, like that kind of like hopping from point to point way of encountering ideas, and, you know, go down to the library, check out the next book, you know, was an intellectual formation. Like, I mean, that is, and it has to begin with some kind of fascination, with some kind of like totally non-intellectual, passionate, boredom driven, resentful even kind of encounter. And you can't induce that. You can't act it like, as an educator, you know that you can't be like Robin fucking Williams in like the Dead Poet Society and like induce that in a student, but you can produce the conditions in which that kind of encounter is possible. Like you know, I made a joke like earlier today, you know, like there's somebody about who's teaching a Marx, Nietzsche, Freud class. It's like, oh, you're going to ruin somebody's fucking life tomorrow, aren't you? You know, but it's true. Like, I mean, you can, if you teach it well, like what you are doing is producing the conditions for an encounter with a set of ideas that will suddenly explode outwards into a whole different network of thoughts. And that might be just because you caught somebody on the right day.
Not often.
You can't, yeah. Go on, what?
No, I'm disagreeing with you. It's often. I mean, probably more often than not. It's like the circumstances for good pedagogy. I teach teachers, and I deal with pedagogical. Like, I don't teach teachers so much right now. I mentor them right now, but like I've taught teachers before. And one of the things that I always say is like, you're going to get a bunch of pedagogical theories thrown at you. Some of them are going to be valid, some of them are not. But the key is, those might all be good tools for your toolbox. They might help you break anything, but you don't actually know all the context that your students are coming in with, or that a person's going to come to your fucking show on, or with, or whatever. And you're laying it down for them, for them to address and deal with. And hopefully, you know, it sounds like, you know, people might hear us and think, oh, you guys are making fun of the meme stuff. No, the meme stuff is fine as long as you don't get stuck there. Like, as long as that's not where your interest and understanding stop. Like,
as long as it doesn't just become this kind of like what we said, like I know that song, you know, as long as it doesn't just become this sort of broken record that you play in your head over and over again and cycle through. I mean, this happens with a lot of like Lacanians. Like there are certain theory traditions that really produce this, like Lacanians and Deleuzians, who see deterritorialization, like who see objet a, who just see, like you want to hear the slogans repeated over and over again. You know, like Sartre had a word for that. It's seriality, right? Like you want, you know, you listen to the party broadcast and the slogans, and you get genuine pleasure out of it, but it's sort of the pleasure of bad faith, of pure, this sort of pure habitual experience of pleasurable familiarity, as opposed to that does not actually increase your capacities for acting, you know, in the Spinoza sense, that does not actually make you more free in any kind of material, like, you know, even not even material, but like in any kind of way, like in any existential way, that, you know, I mean, like maybe that's like that sounds woo-woo, like in some ways, but like I think it's worth saying, like when you are educating people, you're educating them to put a little bit of distance between themselves and all of the various determinations that are acting upon them. Not like we're making critical thinkers, like not that shit, but like just I want you to be able to sort of exist in a state of frustration, in a state of minimal distance from what you are being told, because only then are you going to be able to engage with it, anything that's not merely reactionary.
Yeah.
I don't know how to explain that to some fucking 18-year-old who's hungover and like and is like, can't you just read the syllabus and let us go now? Like I don't know how to.
I mean, well, to be fair to 18-year-olds, that problem is eternal. But
oh yeah, that's not now. That's and that is that's true for That's true for 80-year-olds as much as 18-year-olds, and it's been true since, Plato's Academy. That's not, but still,
right.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
I think the thing with I'm going to sound, as a person who actually really enjoys working with young people, I don't want people to think I'm like some bitter old man just constantly yelling, "Get off my lawn." But I will say that, like, one of the ironies of high school is in both literature and in math and in a lot of things, you're encountering things dumbed down and before you're ready for them. Like I read The Great Gatsby. It's a book that's often underplayed now. It's cliche in a lot of ways because it's like 150 pages. You can teach it in a month. It has obvious symbolism in it, blah, blah, blah. It's a remarkably rich book that is wasted on when you teach it and who you teach it on and with. And some people will see that and come back to it later in life. Some people like me will be poisoned by their encounter with it in high school and then only like it after they've taught it 5 times and start seeing like maybe I gaslit myself into thinking it's a good book. But nonetheless, it is sort of wasted on the time. And I can think of it all the back teen. I was taught back teen at the same class that I'm mentioning. Got given the dialogic imagination. It didn't mean a shit to me, right? Now that book, rereading that book at 40, holy fucking shit! Like it's just it's like truly eye-opening to all kinds of things that you can do with theory and education and theories of mind and development of it. And it even has implications for how I could do activism and stuff like it really is mind blowing. But it's because of when I approach it. And then there's other books I guess the obvious examples like Catcher in the Rye. Catcher in the Rye in your 30s and you didn't read it when you were 19. That book is stupid. So I fully get why if I had encountered it as a 15-year-old to a 19-year-old and then read it again in my 30s, it would actually mean something to me because I see both sides.
Ooh, my man.
But anyway, no, we're back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. So you see the sides of the book, but at the end of the day, and people say, "Oh, that's easy with literature." It's like that. No, it's like that with math. I was a late learner with math. The beauty and awesomeness of math did not occur to me till I was 22 years old. I do wish sometimes it occurred to me younger because I probably would have had a more lucrative career. But nonetheless, it's amazing once you start realizing all that it can do. And all that it doesn't do too. Me and the math.
It will not give you communism. You cannot derive communism from set theory. I'm sorry, guys. You can derive eternal terror, evidently, but you cannot get that. Does not equal communism. Yeah.
Me and set theory. It's a fun little thing. I mean, but so I don't want people to just think it's like literature books. It's movies. It's all kinds of stuff. It's sometimes. I'll be honest. Sometimes it's fucking video games. I'm not a video game person, but I have seen people whose mind gets set on fire beginning with a goddamn video game. So I don't want people to think that we're just stodgy academics about this. Like,
no. Again, I do, like, it's no resent. Like, I do not resent the student who does not. Like, I think people mistake this, like, my, like, from the Substack and from the Twitter, like, that I, like, dislike my students or something. I don't. Like, I fucking like my students. I think that they're fun to talk to. Like, I like to shoot the shit with them. I like to smoke cigarettes with them. I like to hang out with them. Like, I like to teach them. At the same time, it is obvious that they have been systematically disserved. Like, that, and that there is a baseline capacity to attend, to sit quietly by themselves and attend to something that, for a slew of reasons, they did not get. Like, and there is a generation that's maybe 15 years wide that has simply not received that, to the point, like, I have these wealthy relatives by marriage who have a kid. They're sending him to a $70,000 a year private grammar school where there's no laptops. Like, it's like technology free, like third grade, to write with a pen and paper. Like, if that's what the fucking bourgeois are doing, maybe we should all consider that instead of bringing an AI into the classroom. Like, it's not, because what somebody somewhere is realizing that the capacity to attend is actually necessary. We are fucked if we have, an entire workforce that can't sit still for 2 seconds. We're actually,
what kind of subjects can lead a revolution or even get reforms when they can't fucking?
Yeah, you're fucked from the liberal side. You're fucked if, you're not. There's so much for party discipline. We thought it was bad now, motherfucker. Like, it's gonna get worse.
Right.
Like, the Swifties are not gonna lead us into. Oh God, now I really got to not say that.
Right.
But yeah,
but yeah, I'm with you, and people often mistake this as like me having contempt for the young too, and it's more like, no, I'm just you don't like what I'm saying because it has some profound, almost symbolic violence to it. But it's not that I blame you. I blame me. I blame the entire society around us. I blame technology. I blame people being lied to about what technology does and does not do, and when you should encounter it. And I say this as a person who works at an online program at this point in my life. Like, I know the problems and limitations of it, but I've seen it like you have. I've seen the elites go more and more back to traditional education, and even the upper middle class being peddled a bunch of like stuff that engenders utter dependency. I was sitting with a code teacher, and we were talking to people who were dealing with AI, and I'm like, if we don't teach people how to code, even if they don't know how, they're utterly dependent on the people who coded the fucking AI. So they're utterly dependent on Silicon Valley, and they can't question it. And that dependency will not just be immediate it'll be dead dependency on dead labor. And I see this in secondary sources in academia too. Like, how many? It's hard to. Like, I'm going to say this with academics. I see academics saying they read primary sources, but when I check it, they've read the secondary source, found the primary source in the secondary source, repeated that, and then repeated the misreading. And so I don't just want people to think this is not just at the like lower levels of society. This is endemic, even at the highest fucking levels.
No, this is endemic. I mean, this is like every week there's another like AI scandal in the sciences, especially in the fucking sciences, because it's even easier to track it because that data analysis parts of scientific papers are being just fed into AI, and they're forgetting to erase the part where the AI says, "Thank you, like I am an AI. Here is your answer." Like, it's
right.
Just,
are they forgetting the check for hallucinations?
Yeah, or both, and it is, it's dependency. Like, that's exactly what it is, and I don't know how to explain. I mean, this is Spinoza, right? Like, how do you explain to somebody who is in a situation of total bondage, but does not understand it to be bondage? How do you like open up? I mean, this is like what I think is the most useful concept out of the late Althusser, like, in the philosophy of the encounter, like pour faire le vide. Like, how do you open the void? How do you make a gap? Like evacuate a little bit of space between yourself and like that upon which you are dependent. And I mean, like, I don't think that I'm not saying like move to the woods and grow your own beans. Like, this is not Thoreau. This is
not here at Thoreau. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Like I think people are going to hear that, because that is an answer that the right is providing, is a sort of like self-sufficiency, self-dependency, whatever. That's
a good way to starve, by the way. Yeah. When we say, when I say dependency, I mean utter dependency. When I'm not saying total self-sufficiency isn't fucking possible. Humans do not do that. That is actually our strength, that we do not do that. Like, we are weak fucking monkeys. A chimpanzee can easily rip my face off. I've met some. They can do it. Like,
God.
Social learning is our advantage, but social learning does not mean being dependent on dead labor. And as a Marxist, we can understand that, but
right.
It was really thinking about the cost of being dependent on dead labor that really made me, which under certain circumstances isn't even a bad thing, but because we're all dependent on dead labor. Like, intellectual accumulation is dependency on dead intellectual labor. But when you're just dependent on it, like, you no longer know how to do the things that were done in the past. And people a lot of people, even a lot of leftists who should know better, have this idea of Whiggish history where they forget. People all the time forget how to create basic technologies. They may or may not need them, but it's a problem when they do. I always bring up a couple of examples. 2 saws after the fall of the Roman Empire in Britain, pillars in Egypt, because I saw it myself when I lived there. There was like 1,000 years where they forgot how to make pillars, but had buildings that were still fucking dependent on them. So they just had to steal them from other old buildings. So you go into early mosques and they're just full of like random pillars of things. Like, it's because the technology and the craft and the skill set was lost, probably because of overproduction, frankly, and they didn't need it for a little while, but then they forgot how to do it. And then they needed it again. A modern example is military vehicles that don't have electronics in them, like those Jeeps that they used to just drop out of planes that a crew of 5 people could put together in 35 minutes.
Right.
We can't do that now. And I think when it comes, to bring this back to theory, because this is it kind of seems off topic and we've gone for a while, and I think this is a good point in off of. But it also, we also are unable to recreate what this theory originally did. We are using it as like a dead machine.
Yeah. No, this is exactly. Yeah, this is exactly where we're going with it. Yeah, it's because if you just encounter like Althusser, like the concept of the ISA, like the ideological state apparatus, and you do not understand that Althusser is a crypto-Maoist Catholic, the concept of the capital S subject is going to make no fucking sense, and you are going to completely misread like what he's talking about there. Like, if you don't, if you read his his work on like that is like reading Machiavelli without knowing that the Prince was addressed to Cesare Borgia. Like, right. It is just,
which a lot of people do read it that way. So.
It is a and this is not like just being like pretentious academic Like, you got to get the history right or else you're not an expert. This is like you are fucked if you don't realize this. Like, you will end up in a bad theoretical place, and that will put you in a bad practical place. Like, and there are
theory
stakes
matters.
to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
theory matters.
Yeah.
I want to bring that up. Theory matters. Our scientists wouldn't care about theory. And you're like, what do you mean scientists? Scientists definitely care about theory. That's their frameworks and models for being able to talk about the physical world. Theory fucking matters. It is not just a way to like, I'm going to use it as a toolbox to explain. Like, if that's all it is to you, it's fine for writing papers, man. I'm not going to judge you for that. You got to make a living how you got to make a living. You got to meet your academic paper count that no one's going to read anyway. But this is larger than that, and this was my critique of pragmatism has always been, except for Peirce, who I don't think is guilty of this, but I do think James and to some degree Dewey are. Assumption,
Dewey for sure, yeah.
The assumption that what is good is obvious and justified. It's like that point that Zizek often makes about empiricism. The empiricists don't realize that their descriptors contain norms, and thus they repeat unempirical data as empirical facts because they're not realizing they're already in their descriptors. And so, this is a problem in pragmatism too. It's like, oh, we've normalized what is good. What is the cash value? But often it's not clear what the cash value is, even monetarily. So it's like, these are things that we have to really break down. They seem obvious, but once you have a real encounter, and I want people to say, this real encounter could be fucking welding, guys. I'm not even talking about just intellectual shit, or obviously intellectual shit. Like, but once you have a real encounter with something that you really have to break down and master, even if it's a physical thing or like, or an athletic thing or something, it's going to change this attitude. And if you treat it as a machine, as a lot of people treat a lot of this French theory, it's going to have a cost. And I'm going to let you have the last word and then plug, and then we'll be done.
That's right. Oh, fuck. Now I don't know what to say. What the fuck? It's a question. God, the histories of the theory, they need to be taught. We need to find a better way to teach them. We need to find a way to plug them in. We need people whose job it is to teach theory and the history of theory in academia, and we need people who are engaged in praxis to understand the history of what they're talking about. Like, this should not be a controversial point. This is not an elitist point, and this is not like, somehow a CIA op. Like, this is just hard historical materialism. You need to know where the fuck you're coming from. So, I got nothing to plug.
Yeah,
I just finished. I got nothing to plug.
All right. Well, I'll say, go read your Substack. It will be listed in the show notes. I found it pretty good. I've actually quite enjoyed it, which is how you're on the show. Otherwise, you're just a random person that I encountered on Twitter. Which, by the way, peeps, I want you guys to know, the criterion for getting on a Varn show is that I find you interesting. That's pretty much it.
I had no idea. That's really sweet, actually. Thank you.
So like, I don't even have to agree with you. I just have to find you interesting. I might think you're horribly wrong, but in incredibly productive ways. So
are you interested by my like incredible masochistic tendency to get yelled at by like all of American academia on a weekly basis? Is that what interests you?
I'm friends with Colin Drum. Not a person I agree with, but a person I find fascinating. And he deeply enjoys having all of academia yell at him on X.
He's such a fucking pervert, man. He is such a...
Yeah, I have refrained from saying so, but I will not push back on that assertion at all. So, but I mean, I do think this is, sometimes it's I've only been ratioed or the main character. I've never been the main character, but I've only been like the main character on Twitter for like weird shit. Like one time saying that the thing that got me ratioed the most on Twitter was me saying that pretending that JFK had secretly become a communist is just an inversion of the Bircher's theory that he had secretly become a Bircher to fight globalists, and that's why he was assassinated. And oh my God, I didn't even say that the Warren report was true or something. Like, it was just like that was the thing that got. I was like, I didn't even get ratioed for anything cool.
That was a fucking bad week, man. All I said was kids should read books, bro. I don't know what I did wrong. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh God, that was so fucking funny. Oh God!
My wife got so fucking mad at me about that. Okay, all right,
all right. Well,
thanks,
now that we're trauma bonded, we're gonna end the show. Have a great day.
All right, bye, dude.